Welcome to part 2. We're still in 2037. We're still in the future. We'll be addressing data, robotics, gamification, and then afterwards we'll go to a launch session that'll be very, very exciting. Now, we're putting this together. Clearly, data interpretability is a huge question mark, and how we're going to handle it. And I thought we had to tackle it head on. And I had the opportunity to meet with Tate Gilchrist, who's going to be speaking to us in just a second. There's tremendous experience in this space. He's currently lead provider of partnerships at Datavant. Previously, he spent 8 years as Cerner, which actually is really cool because he understands our world. But not only that, he understands our orthopedic world even better. I think you started your life as an orthopedic rep for Johnson & Johnson in Asheville, right? So it couldn't have been a better person to get us off going on the question of data interoperability and its impact on orthopedics and where we're going in the next 15 years. Tate?
Okay, so it looks like I have the coveted post-lunch slot, and not only post-lunch, but post-dessert. So if you fall asleep, I'm going to blame the sugar. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to spend a few minutes speaking to the future insofar as data exchange. And we'll start off with just a few disclosures. Stefano mentioned I do work for Datavant, SciOx. And so let's kind of delve right in here a little bit. So this is a slide, and I feel sorry for the individual that had to do the cutting and pasting for this slide. I'm sure they had some carpal tunnel at the end of the day. But this is just kind of a representative slice of current state, who is out there exchanging data and in what manner now. So this slide has big companies like Epic, Cerner, Meditech. It has small little companies. These companies are dealing with identified data. They're dealing with de-identified data. They're dealing with all different data types, everything from imaging, SDOH data, genomics, clinical data, structured, unstructured. And this list really grows exponentially, by the day. So it's a really interesting space. There's some estimates out there right now that there is 2 trillion gigabytes of healthcare data and growing exponentially. So it's a large problem, to say the least. There are a lot of interesting companies and entities on this slide that have various levels of maturity and complexity in how they manage data. There are companies on this slide that are primarily concerned with the HIM departments of hospitals with manual processes, abstractors, chasing charts, pulling data, abstracting data, faxing it on. I think there's the stat is something like 90% of hospitals in the United States still use a fax machine as their primary means of data transfer. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have companies that are using things like privacy-preserving record linkage and natural language processing to do some really interesting things. So the point is that there is a large variety currently and a large delta in between the ways in which companies are managing and holding data. And as we look forward into the future, the ideal state is for that gap certainly to substantially narrow and to take us off in a new direction. The last thing I'll say here is that there's one common thread between all these entities on this slide, and that's the patient. The patient is the only thing that all of these entities have in common. So it's my view that the patient will be the center of interoperability in 15 years' time, and we'll go into that and talk a little bit about it. So this slide kind of gives a overview of the timeline as we look forward 15 years. I think it's probably important to, if we're going to track out where we're going or where we might go, it's important to kind of take a look back and see where we've been and how we've gotten to this point. So if you look back to the 2000s, and as Stefano mentioned, I had the opportunity of participating in the EMR wars, if you could call them that. So it was hand-to-hand combat in many ways, shapes, or form. And you would assume that, when you're going to digitize historically paper records, you want to design things with the future in mind. And I think that there was certainly a desire to do that. I think that there was not a very good attempt at success in that regard. It was very competitive. So The digitization of the record insofar as the EMRs and all the incentives that were poured out from the federal government to put EMRs in many ways created a foundation that was very siloed. A lot of walled gardens, a lot of walls, and lack of interest in sharing records, et cetera. So kind of moving on up the food chain here. So there was a period of time underneath this broad umbrella, called population health, where there was a huge effort in centralizing and aggregating data. This was primarily around at-risk contracts with attributed physicians, with Medicare plans and private plans, where you had entities that were culling data from multiple sources. They were combining it, aggregating it, normalizing it, applying common ontologies to it, and creating a longitudinal record to be able to drive at-risk contracts with payers. So that continues to this day, but it was a huge effort back in the 2010s. And I got to participate in that a little bit as well, which is very interesting. So where we're at now is we're in a situation where there's a tremendous amount of legislation that's coming to fruition. Much of that legislation is around the involvement of the consumer or the patient. So we're going to talk about that on the next slide a little bit, but there's a huge push with some very definitive timelines with some, quite frankly, large sticks that would result from lack of compliance with these regulations that really puts the patient at the center of things and really puts some walls up insofar as what companies that hold and manage data can do, can't do, how they expose data, in what manner, and under what penalties. So if we look forward a little bit, going on up to 2035, I believe that over the next few years, what we're going to see is we're going to see huge efforts around patient consent. And what that means insofar as being able to grant consent for companies to do something with your data and to audit the companies that are doing something with your data as an individual. I think that probably everybody in this room would agree that insofar as a patient being involved, actively involved in their health, there's a big variation there. There's some people, some patients that really want to get involved. They want to get their data, they want to do things with it. They're pulling it down onto their phone, they're running with apps, they're using it to track things, they're using it to communicate between their providers, their family, et cetera. And then there's a large proportion of patients that really just, for whatever reason, do not want to get involved. They don't care. The obesity rate in this country has gone up every year. So it's, really rare that there is at-scale type of patient involvement from the standpoint of them being really into directing their care, doing things themselves. But what I think that will happen is that as you look on forward into 2035 and this notion of a mediated exchange, that patients will not so much be involved insofar as being actively involved on their phones, on their computers, or whatever, but they will be actively involved in consenting to and allowing others to do things with their data for their good. So this kind of drives into the last slide here that I have. You think of three factors, basically, that are going to kind of drive the patient being at the center of all things in 2035. I really kind of break it down with three buckets, if you will. There's a regulatory bucket, there's a technology and architecture bucket, and then there's some economic models that drive things a little bit. So looking at this first one, this regulatory bucket, this is a huge space of activity for the past 2-3 years and currently. 21st Century Cures Act, I'm sure probably most of the folks in this room have heard about that, really laid out a framework that makes it very difficult for information blocking to take place. There's large penalties associated with information blocking. It requires a lot of companies to open up their data stores so the patients can have access to them. And this is really becoming, this coming fall in October, there's some interesting regulation around all EHI. So in October of this year, all EHI, this includes imaging data, clinical data, whatever data is associated with the patient needs to be made available in electronic format. This is going to have a pretty significant impact on all the hospitals, the health systems, the providers that are holding patient data. So I frankly think that there's a substantial portion of providers that are not prepared for this. I think that some are, but there's going to be a really interesting situation this fall insofar as, what people are going to see that, oh, I didn't know that, I was supposed to do this, or we're not prepared for this. And as I mentioned before, under 21st century cures, there's some fairly substantial penalties that are associated with this. There's some legislation out there now that's kind of going through called TEFCA. It's a Trusted Exchange Framework and the Common Agreement. And so this is a framework by which that the government has said that, we need to basically facilitate a common agreement in between health networks that allows a regulation layer to make sure that everybody is on the same sheet of music insofar as how patients can access what they can, what they're permitted to get, what other entities are permitted to get. And again, it really puts the patient at the center of things. By and large, HIPAA is the one governing piece of regulation that kind of sits over top of all healthcare data, but there's also an interesting angle with the FTC. So under 21st century cures and the notion of a patient granting consent for a third party to be able to pull their data, when a patient does that, it takes them out of the umbrella of HIPAA and puts them under the umbrella of the FTC. So the FTC is not really an organization that's set up to be able to regulate this type of activity. So it perhaps creates a little bit of risk, should we say, insofar as having regulation that's got some teeth to it, protecting patient privacy, et cetera. So I anticipate over time that the FTC is going to really take a lot more substantial role in this space and in regulating this space. There's also some interesting public-private partnerships, and the main one I think was the Argonaut project, which is a project between the ONC, Office of National Coordinator, as well as a lot of the large EMR companies, Cerners, the Epics, the Athenas, et cetera. And so this is the organization that really brought the FHIR standard to the market, if you will. There's also some other public-private partnerships associated with the Caron Alliance, which is a public-private partnership based out of Salt Lake City, Utah. They're doing some interesting things related to the patient's ability to use a universal authentication process to be able to access their data. Currently, if I'm a patient and I want to access my data in an EMR, whether it's Cerner, Epic, et cetera, I used to have to use authentication credentials associated with that particular EMR company, which is very confusing for a patient. The patient just wants to use a single authentication pathway, so organizations like the Caron Alliance are facilitating a framework to allow the patient to do that universally across EMRs. So the point is that there's a large regulatory body that's geared toward the patient and empowering the patient to not only get involved, but to grant others the consent to get involved on their behalf. The second piece is really the technology and architecture piece. And, there's a huge variance here. So at the top of the list up there, you've got a lot of entities that are still using manual abstractors, individuals, elbows and toes in the HIM departments in the hospitals all across the US. There are thousands of them across the US right now. I think it's something like 90% of hospitals are using the fax as still the primary means of interoperability and moving records. So all that needs to be digitized, right? That's a hard process, but it's a process that's underway. I think that, it's moving in the right direction. Secondly, the source data system, so mainly the EMR companies. From a technology and architecture standpoint, you would think that there's a common phrase that, technology is not the problem in interoperability or data exchange. It's a people problem. And that's true to some degree, but I will say as an individual that's kind of been on the inside, the ability for an EMR company to just expose an API for a particular, data element, it's not as easy as it sounds. The size of some of these entities, the complexity internally from an operational standpoint, from just a people standpoint, you may have 4 different layers in an EMR managed by 4 different teams that all have to be on the same sheet of music to be able to expose a single API element out externally. And I'll be frank in saying that to get that done in a large organization is really an act of God. So while technology is not the issue. The individuals and the governance around managing that technology can be an issue. You've got a lot of the aggregators out there. There's a huge push around, there's a huge push in the 2010s around, as I mentioned, around consolidating data, centralizing data in one spot. That continues to this day. There is an organization started by Providence out of Seattle called Truveta. I think they have somewhere upwards of 16%, almost 20% of the healthcare data in the US consolidated. They're consolidating in one spot to be able to do some interesting things around research. There's another one called Graphite Health. It's Intermountain and Kaiser and a few others. They're doing the same type of thing. So there's still a tremendous amount of data aggregation, data centralization going on in the market. The other side of that coin is that there's a substantial number of federated networks. So you have your Commonwealths, you have your Care Qualities, you have your e-health exchanges. These are all networks that are facilitating, different types of connections in a federated model to where a provider can query over this federated model, find a patient via record locator service, and pull it back. And they continue to grow by the day as well. Fire APIs this was my world for about 3 years. It was a very interesting place. The 21st Century Cures and the ONC really pushed out the Fire APIs, a standardized API to allow an application to be able to connect to Cerner and Epic and Athena and others just as easily across the board. One of the things that I really appreciated about that space is that in contrast to the first kind of EMR wars, the notion of Fire APIs and standardized access to data really brought these companies together. And so for the first time, I could remember being on stage with Epic and some others and being able to talk about our technology, being able to talk about our business models, whereas before everything was kind of done in secret, it was very competitive, et cetera. So the Fire APIs really brought on an era of cooperation, I will say. QHINs and RCEs. A QHIN is a Qualified Health Information Network. This is a structure that is governed in many ways by the TEFCA framework. So QHINs are essentially a network of networks with a layer of governance over top of it from the regional coordinating entity, which in the United States right now is the Sequoia Group out of Arizona, I believe. And lastly, the notion of privacy-preserving record linkage and tokenized networks. So this is a very interesting space. This is a distributed network, de-identified, that facilitates tokenized data exchange across a wide variety of different stakeholders. So those networks are growing by the day and facilitate a lot of the exchange you see out there now. From an economic model standpoint, there's a few right now. So obviously the requester monetization pass. So if I am a payer and I need to get patient data for the purposes of risk adjustment or things of that nature, typically I'm having to pay for that access. You have open patient access. So again, under 21st Century Cures, I as a patient have the ability to use an app of my choosing and connect up to my data wherever it sits in whatever EMR. So there's some open access there. There's some metered exchange types of models, which are inherently consumption-based models that are out there. And then finally, there's this last bullet that I think is really key for this 2035 look, and that's the notion of patient incentivization. There's already probably a little bit of that out there right now from the standpoint of if I'm a patient and I work for an employer that is self-insured. If my employer gives me a Fitbit or some other type of device where I can collect my steps or some other types of biometrics, and then will reduce my premium based on the fact that maybe I walk 20,000 steps a day or 15,000 steps a day. So there's some incentivization there as well. There's some interesting companies out there right now that are exploring ways to essentially incentivize the patient by allowing them access to some sort of data brokerage type of network. These are very immature companies at this point in time, but I think that as we look forward, if the patient is to be at the middle, and if the patient is to be in control of where their data is at, where it's going, who is using it, and for what purpose. We have to have an architecture that facilitates that, which I do believe is being formulated currently. It's a monumental task. We have to have a regulatory framework that ensures that it takes place, which I believe the pieces are in place for that. But importantly, we have to have some sort of incentivization for that patient to participate, or at least to grant others the authority to participate on their behalf. And while we're not there yet, there's signs that we're moving in that direction and that there will be something in place there to be able to facilitate that. So with that, I will stop. Thank you.
That's phenomenal. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm going to ask you one quick question.
Yes.
First of all, I think you gave us an insight into just how big this issue of data exchange, data interoperability is. You talked a little bit, you touched a little bit about data exchanges, data federation. Going literally 2037 again, this idea of moving forward. Are we still going to be talking about data interoperability? Is it going to be something we solved in the 2020s to the point where it's either in the blockchain or it's somehow not managed, or it's just, or all data is transacted as a synthetic data set, which does not have to stand behind some kind of background. Where's it going to go?
Just for the record, you used the B word, not me.
Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about tomorrow too.
So I think that, if you look at, again, where we were and where we're at now inside a 10, 12-year span, in many ways, we've made tremendous progress, and there's some individuals and entities that are doing some very progressive, phenomenal things around, NLP and unstructured notes and all this stuff. On the flip side of the coin, there's still a great deal of data exchange that is just manual grunt work. So I think the answer potentially is yes and no, that we will have an appreciable mass of progressive and on-the-ball technology to do some seamless type of work, but there will still always be a body of work where, we're going to need to make tremendous improvements because people are slow to change. It's expensive to change. From a health system standpoint, the bandwidth to get all this in place and implement it, et cetera, is quite, it's onerous. So I think the answer is yes. You mentioned blockchain. I will make the comment that...
The B word.
Yeah, the B word, yeah.
Some people don't like it.
I love it, right? I love it. But I think that in many ways it's an unknown, right? I think that blockchain is, in my view, really ideally suited to facilitate some level of consent, some level of audit, and then some level of directory. So I, as a patient, can use the blockchain to determine, who I want to give my consent to audit where my data is at, where it's going, and then to use it as a directory of individuals or entities that I can then engage with. I'm unsure about actual data being on the blockchain, but I think those three things from a distributed ledger standpoint offer some promise.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Right. Cheers.
So we ended with the discussion, and he started the discussion also of the patient owning their data, the patient owning the data and be able to share the data, making it accessible to entities. And it was also interesting to hear about the fact that at some point we'll grant access to that data to other entities. So to follow Tate's discussion with an absolutely perfectly placed speaker, because our next speaker spent 23 years at Microsoft. And during that time, he actually led the Health Vault initiative, which was one of the first efforts at creating the personal data. Oh, I'm losing it. The personal health record is what I was trying to say. Since then, he co-founded a LifeVantage, an incubator, which he ran for some time until he decided to run his own company again, and this time Sensory Health. So to Davide Vigano, ti invito sul palcoscenico.
Grazie. I got it.
Oh,
Thank you, Stefan. Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I think Tate did a masterful job in the last 20 minutes to actually walk through the major, what he called buckets of interoperability, right? There is a regulatory bucket, there is an economic bucket, and there is a technology bucket. So on a Thursday afternoon after lunch, you may ask yourself now, why should I care, right? Depending on whether you are an orthopedic surgeon, whether you work in a technology company, why is interoperability important to you or not? So I will try in the next 20 minutes to actually walk you through and see what we have learned in the past 15 years, and hopefully move forward to the next level, and potentially making new mistakes and trying not to replicate the same mistakes that we have made in the past. So we launched at Microsoft, I still say we after over 20 years at Microsoft, we launched Health Vault in 2007. Health Vault was designed to be a patient-centric record, a platform before Azure and AWS even existed. So we had to create our own cloud system because there was no cloud system to speak of at that time. So you can imagine the technology challenges that we had faced. We delivered Health Vault in 2009, and Microsoft completely retired the product in 2019. Why? This is an article from HIT Consulting that actually, I think, summarized the downfall of Health Vault, if you will. There were multiple reasons, but clearly there are three main reasons why Health Vault did not succeed. Number one, the data that we could collect was very, very limited, primarily from a patient. Patients don't like to wear medical devices. We interfaces about 425 medical devices just to learn that there was no data coming through. People say one thing, but they do another, right? I see some people smiling in this audience, right? We all do to some extent, right? Number two, we have some data that simply we're not generating. We need data that doesn't exist out there. We call it novel data sets. And number three, we have a massive, massive data quality issue. Even when we find the data sucks. Very often is the wrong data. So at Microsoft at that time, we spent a substantial amount of time and investment to create another code base that we called Amalga. And Amalga was designed to basically suck the data out of any type of EHR system, any type of silo at the enterprise level, get this data, both DICOM and HL7 data, into some type of data repository that at discharge, a hospital could actually push a button and send all these images and data into my own personal health record, funded and designed on Health Vault. This was a revolutionary approach that created we had substantial support from Mayo Clinic, NYP, Providence, at that time, St. Joe's here in California, and so forth. People, large enterprise companies, actually visionary ones, bought into it. But other social economic factors prevailed. In the US, and not outside the US as an example, employers resist putting data into any type of PHR because they're really concerned about their employer knowing about their personal health record. I can tell you there is the level of concern in Europe is not even as close as it is in the US. But in the US, it's a real issue. People have that concern, right? So we had to build a system that was granular enough, and as Tate mentioned, who can I give access to my data to and under which rules? So the regulatory aspect is just one of the aspects. The social and economic aspect is as challenging and as big as well. There is always a trusted advisor when it comes to data liquidity. It can be my clinician, it can be my caregiver, it can be a family member. Those are trusted advisors that I may want to grant access to only for a part of my personal health record. I may not want them to know if I went through a total knee arthroplasty that I also have some neurology issues. My decision. May be relevant information, may be relevant data, but I don't want them to know. And it's my data, and therefore, I should be able to do that. So what is data liquidity at the end? Data liquidity is a vision and a journey. And that's probably the only reason why all of you here should care about it. So real data liquidity is obviously complex for the reasons that we discussed in the past 20 minutes. And as you can see here, I'm not even going to try to actually walk you through what a novel architecture for interoperability looks like. What matters in this architecture, which by the way is the one that we actually use at Sensoria as well, is what Tate described as interoperability at the core through the FHIR API. There is no excuse today to leverage core assets such as FHIR to ensure the reduction of paper records and enable real data liquidity. On top of that, companies like Microsoft and Amazon are now providing this type of product as a service. What I mean is, Tate mentioned before, is a challenge to go into the IT of a hospital and find agreement and create consensus on building who's going to actually build that interface, who's going to maintain that interface. So these companies are going now to actually provide that server as a service for interoperability and maintain that service, which of course reduces and removes some of the operational challenges, organizational challenges, bureaucratic challenges that we discussed in the past. But again, why should I, if I'm an orthopedic surgeon, care about this? Well, I would argue that you should care about this because everything you do to improve your performance and you improve your efficiencies and improve outcomes should probably be based on a model that is similar to the one I'm proposing here. This is a very simplistic model. You probably have a better one, right? But at the end of the day, for each patient that you see, you have a T1, T2, T3, and T4, different times, where you baseline your patient. You have a pre-surgery baseline, then you have surgery, and then you have a post-surgery type of operation, right? So for each one of these, you have to basically create a personalized medicine type of model. In Europe, thanks to an FTI European Union grant, we're working with a company like Rejoint, which is building an additive manufacturing personalized knee from scratch using Formula One, Ferrari-like 3D printing technology with cobalt chrome, personalized to the knee of the patient. We're working with companies like OrthoKey that actually design sensors for the alignment of the prosthetic device during surgery. And what we do at Sensoria, we baseline and we monitor the post-op rehabilitation process, right? So the full system in 2022 looks more like the left of this slide, right? I'm asking myself questions that I'm not able to answer because I don't have the right data to answer those questions. Hopefully before 2035, we will be able to actually do what you see on the right side. I'm asking myself questions. I'm able to find the data that actually can provide the foundation to answer those questions, and I can answer those questions correctly to improve my performance and improve outcomes and reduce cost and increase access for the whole healthcare system. So there is, of course, a very broad cost implication on that. So the smart surgery engine, if you will, the patient journey, can be designed on data that exists, that comes from EMRs, and also novel data sets that come from sensors, combined into a unique protocol that can improve the performance of the surgeon, improve the performance of the physical therapist, base the data on quantified data, not just a KOOS score after surgery, as an example, and move from there. So to do that, Google, Sensoria, Microsoft, we are IoT enabling multiple devices, right? We realize that self-reported patient data is not sufficient anymore. What you see here is two IMUs on a knee brace that can provide range of motion of a knee. There is no need to ask a patient, did you do your rehab? How many repetitions did you do? The sensors can tell us that, right? So Cleveland Clinic just published two papers in Journal of Arthroplasty proving the fact that this actually provides higher adherence because the patient knows that someone who cares is monitoring him or her. So we have higher adherence on rehabilitation as well. Of course, the patient likes that approach because he can also be part of its own health process and health journey, right? So the range of motion and so forth can actually be Fitbit-like enabled with specific data sets that are specific to the rehabilitation process. But we can go beyond that. We can replace and extend gait lab systems using new wearable devices that are not new at all. We can just inject sensors into whatever the patient decides to wear in the morning, like a simple sock. The socks has 3 tactile pressure sensors at the bottom of the plantar area of the foot. I encourage you to look for the University of Sherbrooke in Canada. They actually designed a full independent study based on extending the gait lab of their aging clinics using an IMU and the 3 tactile pressure sensors in the sock. And they found that the gait quality lab system data that they're collecting from the sock is on par or better than the clinical data that they get from the gait labs. Of course, gait labs cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? There are mocks and cameras around. A sock can be provided to a patient at home. And the socks are less than $200 at this point. Beyond that, of course, we know that weight bearing and double support is crucial after a total knee arthroplasty. How do we measure that? So now combining the data, the self-reported data, and the quantified data coming from knee braces and socks and insoles and so forth, we clearly have a much better picture of where our patient is, right? So that's really our goal. But that's not sufficient. There are multiple other areas that need to help us identify which patient we're actually working with. Is this patient a patient that I need to empower because he's able to use this technology? Is this a patient that I need to support or encourage? Is this patient that is questioning why I'm asking him to do, right? I'm pretty sure that if you're in clinical practice, you probably have met each one of these patients before, right? So technology will not be able to answer all of the questions for us. Your knowledge and your experience will be simply based on more powerful, more meaningful data. And once you actually can collect this type of data, the quantified data and the self-reported patient data can make and create a much more powerful patient-clinician interaction. I can tell you that from my experience, we have clinicians now that ask specific questions like, John, what happened on Wednesday? You were not able to do what you were supposed to on Wednesday. And on Wednesday, a patient, in this case, a diabetic patient with foot-related complications, was saying, well, I was not able to use my device, in this case with an offloading boot, because I have to go and catch a bus. Well, if a podiatrist knows, he can actually prescribe a scooter, right? But if the podiatrist doesn't know, he cannot do what he's supposed to do to actually fix and accommodate or solve that specific issue. In that case, the lack of mechanical offloading on a diabetic ulcer leads to an amputation 75% of the times. Just that issue, just that complication costs the US healthcare system $17.5 billion a year. There is no reason why we should amputate people, I would argue, for normal plantar ulcerations in this country anymore. We're still going through medieval practices because we don't have the data. So you should care. You should have the data. And it's our job as technology players to provide you with the right data at the right time, because your time is precious. So that's really all I had for you. It's really all about human augmentation, if you will. I think you will hear about robotics. Robotics and soft robotics is really all coming in the next 10 to 15 years, and it will help us a lot to actually solve some of these challenges. But with that, I'd love to open it up to your questions if you have any. We still have 2 minutes. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. We went from big data, huge data, and then asked the question, even if we do aggregate that data, access data, is that sufficient to give us the kinds of insight we need to get down to the personalized medicine future that we're all hoping to get to? As you know, I've been working on a very similar concept of how do you bring the gait lab down to something that we can access all the time, everywhere. Where do you see the greatest application for personalized data that is gait level data for patient management? We obviously have some ideas, but you're looking at it from a different perspective. So
no, it's a great question. Parkinson's, we think that there is both a diagnostic and interventional application. We're working very closely with the Michael J. Fox Foundation on that. We have a full clinical trial in Australia right now going on. It's fascinating how Tesla-like electric motors positioned at the ankle bone level can potentially reduce the risk of falls. So imagine a system where once we have the right data, meaningful data, not a lot of data, but meaningful data that can actually train the algorithms, the machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence algorithms, which we cannot train right now because we don't have that quality data. It's amazing what we can do. Instead of just dispatching an ambulance when that patient is on the ground, now we can tell that patient through Alexa, sit down now, you're about to fall.
How many of you, when I asked that question, thought he was going to say total knee replacement or something like that? I don't know how many of you were thinking of collecting data from sensors to educate a robot that helps you walk, bypassing the whole clinical environment together. That's the beauty of bringing together technologists and clinicians together to talk about things, because there's a different perspective. Most of us in the space of digitizing gait are thinking more perioperative, but the ability to connect this data set to other sources of use, such as you pointed out, helping somebody overcome dyskinetic function, is really, really exciting.
Absolutely. I mean, that is exactly, this is a multidisciplinary problem by design, right? Gait as a science was defined by the Germans and the Italians in the mid-1600s. Isn't it interesting that it's 2022 and we still don't have a way to measure counting steps means really nothing, right?
That's
so
right.
Quality data is what we're talking about. So that's what we care about.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you.
So the future of robotics with Emil Demirkan, who is joining us virtually. She's down in Los Angeles, Cal State at Long Beach. She has a very strong interest in rehabilitation or robotics, and she runs the Human Performance and Robotics Lab down there. Got a lot of research on neurocontrol of human joints, but also robots, and spends a lot of time traveling around the world at various robotic centers. And we asked her to give us her perspective on the future of robotics from a different perspective than what we're accustomed to in our somewhat narrow orthopedic perspective world. And to follow, we will have a 30-minute break so you can all recharge and then come back to follow for the last set of lectures. So we'll roll the video clip and we'll come back in a minute. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Emel Demirkan. I'm Associate Professor of Mechanical Engineering and Biomedical Engineering at Cal State Long Beach. And today I'd like to talk about the work that we have been doing over more than a decade now about human movement understanding in robotics and intelligent systems. So I'd like to first thank our sponsors and our students. Without their help, we couldn't, possibly do any of this work. And so I'd like to thank my students for their great contributions. So I always start my presentation with this real-time dynamic simulation. So this data was taken from a professional football player. He used to be a professional quarterback, and he came to our lab, we collected his data, and the motivation behind this was to see what he was optimizing. So the idea is basically to understand from human motion and apply to artificial systems such as robots. Because we know that humans and robots are different in many aspects in terms of their constraints, range of motion, actuation, and control. So we cannot directly copy human motion and apply to a robot motion. So it won't work. So the idea is to understand what is the strategy behind human motion so that we can make robots move like humans. So this idea we started back in 2008, and so this evolved with the advances in the technology, in sensors, in perception, and all the devices that helped us build a wearable system. So this is something I'm going to talk about at the end of my talk. So here is the subject we analyzed 10 years ago. We collected motion capture. And again, the idea was to understanding his skills. So what exactly he's optimizing in his performance. So some of the earlier work that was done during my PhD and postdoc, and when I was visiting professor at the University of Tokyo, all related to understanding human behavior and applying the strategy to artificial systems. So we collected a lot of motion capture data from novice players trying to optimize their performance, or data from professionals to predict their risk of injury. So here's another example of professional college level golfers. Again, the idea was to analyze the dynamic performance. So every player has a different subject-specific analysis. So this really gave us some insights about how to use this information to design and control the next generation of intelligent systems and robots. So this also involves biped locomotion. So we analyzed human gait, collected data from normal subjects, normal populations, as well as patients with neuromusculoskeletal disorders such as cerebral palsy. So this work was in a collaboration with the OpenSim team at Stanford University and the Children's Gate Hospital. So I was involved in some of the projects. So I was able to see the patients in person and collect data on their gait. So we use simulation environments such as OpenSim and others to analyze human gait or bipedal gait, both for designing rehabilitation techniques, but also to understand human locomotion, and then to be able to design artificial systems. So this is another example of analyzing muscle synergies and contributions to the task dynamics during running. So this is one of my student projects. He was a student athlete, so he collected data on himself, and on different inclinations, he was able to show, what is the muscle contributions to running and the center of mass accelerations during running on different inclinations and different ground conditions. So there is the whole physiological constraints in the model, as well as the environmental constraints, such as the friction or the stiction or the ground conditions that can be involved in the analysis. So this brings us to the design of artificial devices. This is one of the projects we had with Japan, designing exoskeletons or assistive devices in the simulation, and then collecting data for validation. So this is one of the projects we had with Japan. So the idea was to validate their devices in the simulation and collect data on real patients and real environments. So this is again given credit to the OpenSim team. I'm so happy to be one of the OpenSim fellow. So we are developing educational as well as research materials together with OpenSim team. One of them is simulation-based assistive device design. So this is an example of a teleoperation using virtual reality and augmented reality. So we have the human operator controlling the slave, which is the robot, in real time. And then we have the full robot dynamics running in the simulation, which in this case, the virtual reality. So this is pretty useful if we want to incorporate virtual reality in the system for rehabilitation purposes, for training purposes, or for any applications that involve teleoperation, which means the operator, the human operator, doesn't need to be in the same environment as the robot. So let's assume we have a surgeon who needs to perform a minimally invasive surgical procedure using a small robot, and the patient is in a different environment, in a different setting. So this is one of the applications we use to train these type of environments. So here is another example of a immersive system. It's called the Cave. It's very similar to the Oculus, but in this case, it's immersive. So you can step inside, navigate through the environment, interact with the objects, and in addition to visual feedback, you can also receive haptic feedback. So when you touch an object, you basically feel the forces. So this is something we implemented in addition to the visual feedback. So the future directions that we focus on is really the portable cyber-physical systems. When I was involved in the US robotics roadmap that we developed 2 years ago with UC San Diego, Professor Henry Christensen, and I was involved in the medical chapter of the US robotics roadmap. And given all the advances in the portable sensors and the computing power, so we really need to focus on helping our physical therapists, our clinicians, and orthopedic surgeons, and all the other people working in the hospital, our nurses and even first responders, helping them to augment their performance and empower them with those sensors that they can use in the field without being confined in a lab environment. So this is something that we focus on, creating portable cyber-physical systems that are fully wireless and requires real-time computation using robust robotic algorithms together with musculoskeletal and biomechanical modeling. Virtual reality is an amazing environment. So it's really just bounded by human imagination. So we can create any environment in such systems, frameworks. One of the projects that my student implemented was to providing haptic feedback for physical and psychological rehabilitation of soccer players. So let's assume we have a soccer player who got injured and who fears to go back to the field. And we want to use this framework to expedite his rehabilitation process using both visual and haptic feedback. So this turned out into a publication, and the idea was, again, consulting our colleagues in physical therapy. We developed this framework that involved different scenarios, visual feedback through VR, and haptic feedback through vibrotactile sensors via the soccer ball. And this turned out to be a great project, and with some related publications. So the next two topics I like to discuss are related to human skills pertaining to manipulation and locomotion. So I'd like to start with manipulation skills. We all know that as humans, we have different types of senses that we rely on when interacting with the environment, when manipulating an object, or navigating through an environment. And really, through this sensation, we get an experience of stimulation of our five senses. So through touch, smell, hearing, sight, and taste. So human brain has one of the third of the neurons dedicated to vision, and then comes touch or haptics. So this is something we can use to develop the next generation of intelligent systems. So that was the motivation behind this project, understanding human perception in manipulation skills. So the question is, can we use visual and haptic feedback to teach an artificial system a human skill? So the idea is to understand human skill through the biomechanical modeling, and then teach an artificial device such as a manipulator or a prosthetic device human manipulation skills. So one of my students, she came with that idea of analyzing human scooping, which is, an activity or a skill that we perform on a daily basis, maybe without even thinking about the task, because we already acquired the skill, and based on our vision and touch senses, we can perform this skill without any computation. So now the question is, can we teach a robot this manipulation skill, such as scooping? So we analyzed, so that was published in RSS some years ago. And we analyzed different types of materials for scooping. So those are materials with different viscosity and different states and shapes, soil, sand, pebbles, and cereals and honey. And we did some motion capture to analyze human postural behaviors during scooping those different materials. So we collected data on the joint angles and the electromyography muscle activations. And based on our effort minimization criteria, we identified what was the optimum posture for a given material. So of course, this involved more in-depth analysis using musculoskeletal software frameworks and studying the mechanics such as the hand impedance, the accelerations, and the timing. So this analysis gave us insights into what is basically humans optimizing, or how humans react for a given material, based on the vision and the haptic feedback. And next was to use perception, because robots, they do not see the material or the location. So the easiest way was to use computer vision, the convolutional neural network, which gave us 100% accuracy about the location and the geometry of the material in front of the robot. So we relied on that algorithm because it was simple to use, and we didn't need any advanced robotics algorithms. It was just computer vision that we needed to, give us the geometry in front of the robot. So we chose one of our robotic manipulators. So this is the Kinova Arm. We chose this platform because it's very similar to human arm, very compliant, and has 6 degrees of freedom. We can program in different settings, impedance control or angular velocity control. And we use the GoPro camera, which gives us, a simple RGB raw data that we can convert into the shape using the convolutional neural network. So here is the high-level view of the system that we generalized for, any given material. So you give the image of the material that is in front of the robot, and then using the network, the robot identifies the material and its location. And then we run the robot motion controller, which is a database of trajectories that we learned from human motion analysis. So the results were quite promising because of the timing of the scooping. As you see, the robot scoops less amount of the material. That was because we didn't have any touch sensor. We only relied on vision. But in terms of the timing, the robot was much more effective to scoop different materials without any error. So that was again published in a paper back in 2017. And there are a couple of aspects we can improve this project, improving via more data from more subjects or including some touch sensors. So this is something that is ongoing, and we are working on different types of manipulation skills using the same process. So next, I'd like to talk about human locomotion skills. So this is something that we have been working on over the last 7 years. The idea is to develop a fully wearable augmentation framework that involves sensing, perception, feedback, and real-time computation of musculoskeletal biomechanics. So the idea is, again, to rely on human vision and touch senses, and to use those two senses to providing feedback to improve locomotion. So yes, the efficiency of human gait can be improved, which in turn will increase human performance or decrease the risk of injury. So this project focused on visual and haptic feedback to improve human gait. And when we deal with those systems, we have to really answer questions such as how the feedback information should be conveyed to human, because every human has a different intuition, different sense of perception, and different, accuracy of feedback perception. So the question was, first question is how the feedback information should be conveyed for a given subject. So it has to be subject specific. And then the next question is, what is human perception's accuracy to sensory information? So how fast humans can react to haptic feedback versus visual feedback. So what is the optimum modality that we can use to improve locomotion? And of course, next question is how humans adapt to those systems in the long term. So how to make sure that such systems are sustainable. So we analyze the longitudinal aspect or adaptation of humans to such systems. So again, talking with our colleagues in physical therapy and kinesiology, we have a description of gait kinematics and their corresponding goals that we want to optimize in the cost function to improve gait, human gait. So there is a lot of research, and this is an ongoing work. This is some of the previous work we relied our project on, increasing the trunk lean, reducing the pelvic drop, forefoot strike, and increasing cadence, which are simple kinematic changes we can control using different degrees of freedoms in the system. So we started with 2 of them, and then we keep improving our system. So how do we improve human gait? Of course, there's a lot of research on minimizing the metabolic cost, or an algorithm that we established back in 2009, minimizing human musculoskeletal effort. We all know that humans exploit the biomechanical advantage of their body within their constraints by minimizing the muscle effort. So this is something we already know. It was established and validated through different data collection. And now can we use this effort minimization in the process so that we can improve the gait and the system is comfortable to the subject. So this requires the efficient robotic algorithms to be included in the musculoskeletal simulation framework. So here you see a bicep curl, a simple activity. So there's only gravity in the system, and you can analyze the effort against the gravity using this belted ellipsoid representation that we established again back in 2009. So this requires computing the ground reaction forces, the mass and inertial properties of the person, and all the additional forces that are acting, such as centrifugal Coriolis forces, contact forces, and such. So here you see the difference between including the effort or the constraints and without including the constraints. So basically, in this case of bicep curls, the constraints are the contact with the ground. So this needs to be accounted for when we're performing a task. So the task dynamics depends on the constraints. So the next question is how the information should be conveyed to human. Again, every person has a different intuition and different perception accuracy. So what is the best modality for providing feedback? So it depends on the task. So in this case, we are focusing on a repetitive dynamic tasks, which is locomotion. Vibrotactile feedback has been proven to be effective in sports performance, especially in locomotion. So there is still no evidence on where the vibrations or the feedback should be given and how many vibration devices humans can perceive simultaneously. Again, this is very subject specific. So we don't have any general answer, and yet we don't have an answer specific to a given person. So this required us to collect data on how the sensory information should be conveyed. We collected different types of data on different populations, healthy populations, at different walking and running speeds. And initially we chose 10 different vibration devices that we reduced to an optimum minimum number based on our algorithm and the data. And that was published in a couple of journals and conference proceedings. So this was an early prototype. Again, you see the cables running. It's not fully wireless. I would say it's wireless, but there is still room for improvement. So that's an early prototype, and we collected some survey data on how comfortable the device was and how easy was to perceive the feedback. So in addition to quantitative data, we also had some qualitative survey part of the project. So here you see the location where the feedback was given, in this case, given on the ankle joints, and we asked the subject to tell us the location and the magnitude of the vibration, and there's always the reaction time involved, and other environmental factors that contributed to the feedback. So in addition to those data, we performed the inverse dynamics to calculate the joint moments and the joint torques during the feedback process. And we were able to decrease the knee flexion moment by providing tactile feedback to the subjects. So decreasing the knee joint moment, knee flexion moment is one of our cost functions in order to improve the gait. In addition to knee flexion moment, we also focus on the knee joint loading. So there's a definition of a knee joint loading using the knee flexion and adduction moments that we defined, and then these make our cost functions in improving human posture. So, of course, this analysis required us to reconstruct human motion in real time. Ultimately, we want to use virtual reality, so we implemented all the system in a gaming engine such as Unity and Unreal. So here you see the real-time control of a musculoskeletal model in Unity using inertial sensors. So that was the first step to reconstruct human motion. And then we improved the system to make it fully portable. So here you see my student running with the whole sensors, IMU sensors, and the feedback system, the vibrotactile sensors. And the computation is done in real time on a laptop computer. And it was, at that time, it was quite remarkable because of the real-time capability, providing real-time feedback and analyzing the motion, the full dynamics in real time. So today we improved this system to make it more comfortable and using less number of sensors. And on the left-hand side, you see the real-time computation of ground reaction forces without using any force or pressure sensors. So this was very remarkable to be able to compute the ground reaction forces without any additional force sensors. So again, this was possible with the great contributions of our colleagues in not only in engineering, but also in physical therapy, kinesiology, the OpenSim team, and the Unity team. So with that, I'd like to thank our sponsors and our students. And thank you again for inviting me. And if you have any questions, please email me, and looking forward to further collaborations. Thank you.